I knew something was off the moment I stepped into the building. It wasn't the way the fluorescent lights buzzed a little too loudly overhead or how the receptionist, who usually offered a warm smile, suddenly avoided my eyes. It was in the silence. The kind that wraps around you like a warning. After 17 years, you learn to read a room before anyone speaks. My heels echoed down the hall as I walked toward my office, past framed posters about teamwork and integrity, words that once meant something here. My badge still worked, which gave me a flicker of hope, but it dimmed the moment I saw the calendar notification. Meeting with Ethan Rowe and Tracy Bell, 9 a.m. No agenda. Just a time and place. I knew before I sat down what it meant. Still, I kept my shoulders square. When I stepped into the conference room, Ethan didn't rise. He barely looked up. Tracy Bell, the HR officer who'd once cried at her own promotion party, gave me a tight-lipped smile I didn't return. "Marissa, please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the far end of the polished table. I didn't sit. "I'll stand." Ethan cleared his throat. "We're making some structural changes, and unfortunately, your position has been impacted." Impacted? I nearly laughed. As if my livelihood had been gently nudged rather than torn away. After 17 years? "There's no easy way to do this," Tracy chimed in, her voice already sliding into that rehearsed HR cadence. "This decision is final. Today will be your last day. No severance package details. No conversation about reassignment. Not even a damn thank you. Just a statement handed down like a verdict. Cold. Efficient. Surgical. Is this about performance?" I asked, watching Ethan's face. His jaw twitched, but he didn't speak. "Or is this about age?" "That's not what this is," Tracy said quickly. "Of course not," I replied, letting the silence stretch. I knew better than to cause a scene. That's what they wanted. I was the quiet one, the reliable one. The woman who built the company's digital architecture brick by brick, who stayed late, who patched the systems no one else could understand. The invisible scaffolding holding sovereign logic together. I nodded once. "I'd like to collect a few things." "You'll be escorted," Tracy said. "Of course." The walk back to my office felt surreal. Everything looked the same, and yet I could feel the walls watching me. Eyes from the finance pod peeked over monitors. A few younger tech analysts ducked their heads. No one said a word. Not even Jillian, my mentee, who looked visibly shaken but frozen in place. I offered her the slightest nod to say, Don't speak. Don't make this harder." Inside my office, the escort, some poor security temp who looked fresh out of undergrad, hovered awkwardly as I placed a few framed photos into a box. My partner Diana. A shot of my son from college graduation. The ceramic mug with the cracked handle. I took nothing else, but I did one final thing before I left. In the bottom drawer, nestled under some old conference badges, was a key I hadn't used in years. It once gave me access to the server closet on the South Campus. And more importantly, it had once been paired with a portable drive I used for off-site backups, part of a contingency plan I developed during the ransomware scare 5 years ago. I hadn't used the drive recently, but I'd kept the key out of instinct. Today, that instinct felt like a lifeline. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. This company had just carved 17 years out of my life and discarded it like a corrupted file. But I didn't cry. I didn't stumble. I walked out of Sovereign Logic with my head high, stepping past the glass doors I had once proudly opened each morning. Outside, the sun was too bright, like it hadn't gotten the memo that my world had just shifted. I paused in the parking lot, breathing in the warm April air. There was a strange clarity in the quiet, like the kind that settles over a landscape after an earthquake. You know the damage has been done, but you're still upright. Still breathing. Still here. I sat in my car for a while, hands resting on the wheel. I could feel the weight of something unfinished pressing against my ribs. This wasn't just downsizing. No, something was wrong. I'd seen the company's financials. I knew what projects were in motion. My termination didn't make sense. It wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. And then a memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, Lucas Ellis, the CFO, had asked for a private report on infrastructure redundancies. Odd phrasing, unusual timing. And Connor Rives, some new consultant, had been unusually eager to shadow me around data compliance. It had all felt disjointed at the time. Now it formed a thread. I turned the key in the ignition and glanced at the box in the passenger seat. My entire career boiled down to a few trinkets and a quiet goodbye. But I had more than they realized. I had knowledge. And I had questions. This wasn't the end. It was the trigger. And something told me, deep in the pit of my gut, that sovereign logic wasn't done with me just yet. The house was silent when I got home, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the slow tick of the kitchen clock. I dropped the box of my belongings on the counter and stared at it like it might rearrange itself into something more meaningful. But it was just a box. Pictures, a mug, a key that didn't belong to anything anymore. A 17-year career condensed into items that wouldn't even fill a single drawer. I made a cup of tea, though I barely tasted it. My mind buzzed with unfinished threads. You don't work somewhere for nearly 2 decades without leaving fingerprints in every corner. I hadn't just been a systems manager, I'd been sovereign logic skeleton key. People came and went. CEOs were replaced. Trends shifted. But I was the one who kept everything stitched together. They called me a lifer behind my back. Said I was dependable. Translation, invisible. Not flashy like some of the new hires, not interested in climbing a social ladder I found meaningless. But I was good. So good they never noticed that their entire infrastructure ran because I had made it resilient enough to survive their ignorance. Now I was outside of it, cut off, but that didn't mean I was powerless. When you're the architect of a system, you know where the pressure points are. You know where the rot starts, even when others pretend the foundation is solid. The key was still warm from my pocket when I pulled it out. I hadn't thought about that off-site backup system in years. Back when Sovereign Logic had been spooked by a ransomware breach across town, I'd pitched a redundant cold storage system housed off campus. At the time, Ethan had waved it off as paranoid, but I'd quietly pushed it through using discretionary budget, small costs spread over a dozen minor line items so no one flagged it. It was approved. It was built. And I'd maintained it silently. And now, standing in my living room with nothing but time, I remembered exactly where that drive was. The following afternoon, I drove 2 hours out to a nondescript facility in Maple Run. Storage lockers, tucked between an abandoned strip mall and a broken-down diner. Locker 203, second floor, left wing. I still had the access code, and my name was still on the lease. They'd never revoked it. Another oversight. Or maybe no one even remembered it existed. Inside, it was dark and musty, and I coughed as I pried open the metal case at the back. Nestled inside, wrapped in anti-static film, was a 4-terabyte drive, discreet, self-encrypting, with a firmware lock only I could bypass. I smiled, just a little. They'd underestimated me. I brought the drive home, booted up my private system, not connected to anything cloud-based, and began indexing. The files weren't just backups of system logs. I'd kept version reports, anomaly flags, user activity heat maps, internal documentation trails. Not because anyone asked. Because I knew one day someone would try something stupid, and they'd look to pin it on the one person too quiet to defend themselves. It wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. The data wasn't just old logs. The last sync had run just a week ago, automatically pulling logs from the nodes I still had admin credentials to, apparently untouched. They hadn't locked me out yet. Another gift. I started combing through the most recent logs, eyes scanning for patterns. It started slow. A few payment requests that bypassed standard flags. Vendor IDs I didn't recognize. But it didn't feel like normal financial activity. It felt constructed, artificial. One vendor caught my eye, Next Core Dynamics. A name that sounded just believable enough to pass casual scrutiny. I searched the records, nothing from 2 years ago, but suddenly active 6 months ago, with steadily increasing invoices. The sums weren't eye-popping, but they added up. I dug deeper. The approval signatures were digital. Lucas Ellis's credentials. CFO. A man who never once asked about infrastructure budgets but suddenly needed to know about redundant systems? Curious. I paused, my heart tapping faster. Nextcore Dynamics didn't exist in any public database. No business license. No digital footprint. Nothing but a shell. And yet, Sovereign Logic had paid them multiple times. And I had the logs to prove it. I leaned back, staring at the screen. They'd pushed me out not because I was redundant, but because I was in the way. I wasn't part of their plan. I was the obstacle. But now I had something they didn't anticipate. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Invisible doesn't mean unaware. And obsolete? That was their mistake. They'd erased me from the building, but they hadn't erased me from the system. And now I had work to do. I didn't sleep that night. I barely blinked. Every hour was spent hunched over my desk, the soft blue light of the monitor casting shadows across the walls. My tea had gone cold hours ago, forgotten next to a growing pile of notes, timestamps, screenshots. The deeper I dug, the more I felt the puzzle pieces sliding into place, pieces I didn't even realize I'd been collecting for months. The payments to Nextcore Dynamics weren't isolated. They formed a quiet trail, tucked into the company's massive transaction logs like digital breadcrumbs waiting to be found. The first flagged invoice was small $3,200 for cloud compliance consulting. Vague enough to pass muster. But there was no contract, no ticket, no point of contact. Just a payment authorization from Lucas Ellis's account. Then another and another. They grew, both in frequency and size. $9,800 for redundant architecture auditing, $16,200 for cyber threat evaluations. All of it nonsense. No deliverables. No support tickets. No footprints. Just payments. Empty ones. I followed the paperless trail with methodical precision, retracing the exact server paths I'd built years ago. I knew which systems talked to each other, which logs updated when, where metadata lingered even after deletions. They'd gotten sloppy. Or maybe they assumed no one would look. That's the risk of removing the person who actually understands the machine you're piloting. I created a fresh documentation folder, local only, encrypted, password protected. Every payment, every timestamp, every IP address was cataloged. But one thing nagged at me. The recipient. Who was Nextcore Dynamics? It wasn't a real company. It wasn't even a shell in the traditional sense. It was a hollow name with an ACH number and a blank online presence. But with some cross-referencing of metadata and trace packets from the archived firewall logs, I found something more telling. A transfer routing trail that bounced through a small community credit union in Missouri. That's when I felt it. That tight twist in my gut. I clicked through the bank's routing records and pulled up associated account holder data from a public access dump I remembered indexing during a compliance audit 3 years ago. That's where I saw the name, Aaron Petrosky. Petrosky wasn't a Sovereign Logic employee, but the name struck a chord. I pulled up our archived employee list. Nothing. So I searched LinkedIn. And there it was, Aaron Petrosky, operations manager at a firm called Trident Systems. But buried in his connections was the link I needed. His brother-in-law? Lucas Ellis. A cold, slow wave spread through my chest. Lucas was laundering money through a fake vendor tied to his brother-in-law. He hadn't even tried to cover the relationship, just assumed no one would ever connect those dots. And maybe no one would have if I hadn't been forced out. If I hadn't had the backups. If I hadn't been the one who remembered every detail, every protocol, every shadow in the system they thought they could ignore. I sat back, staring at the screen. The first instinct was rage, a heat bubbling at the back of my throat. Not just at the betrayal or the criminality, but at the arrogance. They thought I would disappear quietly. That I'd pack up my box, cry in my car, and be forgotten by Monday. But I hadn't left empty-handed. I had taken the one thing that mattered more than office gossip or retirement cakes. I had the truth. I started printing key files, select ones, time-stamped and annotated. Not everything. Just enough to prove a pattern. To start a case. I labeled the folder Breadcrumbs, Level 1. If anything happened to me, it would be enough for someone to pick up the trail. And then I did something even bolder. I logged into my personal email and created a new address, anonymous, untraceable, routed through 3 layers of encryption services I used to train interns on. I sent myself a backup of the folder. Then I created another copy, uploading it to an encrypted flash drive and locking it inside my fireproof safe in the hall closet. Belt and suspenders. Always. Around 4 in the morning, as the first gray sliver of dawn crept through the blinds, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This was no longer about my job. This was bigger than a layoff. It was a rot at the core of the company I'd poured 17 years into, and no one seemed to notice. Or maybe, worse, they noticed, and they looked away. Not me. I'm not looking away. The system might have let them hide for a while, but the system still bore my fingerprints. And I was going to follow every last breadcrumb until the entire trail lit up. There's a moment, just before a storm breaks, when the air turns heavy, when everything feels still, too still, and your body knows before your mind catches up. That's what it felt like as I dug deeper into Sovereign Logic's records. I wasn't uncovering random anomalies anymore. I was tracing a pattern. And patterns are deliberate. After the next core dynamics discovery, I turned my attention to the company's secondary vendor stream, Everglade Consulting. I remembered the name vaguely, tucked into a quarterly finance report maybe 6 months ago. At the time, it hadn't raised alarms. But now, with fresh eyes and a sharper edge, I realized it was another ghost. No incorporation data, no employees, no website, no footprint. Just an invoice trail that began right after I finalized the redundancy upgrade last fall. I followed the logs, starting with a $12,400 invoice for data migration consulting, and then a string of others. $18,000 for risk management strategy, $21,500 for compliance framework review. Buzzwords. Expensive, meaningless buzzwords. All approved by the same chain, Lucas Ellis, and rubber-stamped by Ethan Rowe. And this time, I found the smoking gun. An email thread buried deep in a sandboxed account, one I'd built years ago for senior staff to test confidential communications. I designed the archive protocol myself. No one realized it quietly stored backups of every deleted message that passed through the test system. The thread was short, careless, and damning. It began with a message from Lucas to Ethan: Everglade's next invoice is coming Monday. Bump it through quickly, we'll backdate it as needed. I'm forwarding Rachel's draft to your personal email. Rachel. I opened a new tab and searched Lucas's emergency contacts from our HR redundancy list. There she was. Rachel Ellis. His wife. Everglade Consulting wasn't just another shell, it was a family front. They were funneling company money into accounts owned by Lucas's wife. Brazen. Insultingly so. The same man who once laughed when I suggested a vendor vetting protocol now sat at the center of a spiderweb of fraud. And the most cutting realization? Ethan knew. My own boss. The one who couldn't look me in the eye during the termination meeting. The man who smiled too tightly, spoke too little. He hadn't just approved the payments. He was in on it. Willingly. Silently. Complicit. But that wasn't the end of it. I turned my attention to Connor Rives, the so-called consultant, who had shadowed me the last few weeks before my termination. He had introduced himself with vague credentials, talking circles around compliance and efficiency, always lurking too closely, asking about protocols that weren't part of his so-called audit. I pulled his credentials. They were incomplete. The IT access I'd provisioned had bounced against several legacy security flags, which, thankfully, still existed because I'd refused to decommission them, despite pushback. That saved me. It meant I still had log traces. Connor had accessed my documentation folders. He'd browsed old project planning templates, deleted copies of compliance reports, and transferred copies of access authorization lists, ones only HR and I were supposed to touch. I stared at the logs, bile rising in my throat. He wasn't there to learn from me. He was planted to monitor me, to replicate and delete what I'd built, to dismantle my authority from within while making it seem like I was simply obsolete. A layer at a time, they had peeled me from the structure I had built. First discredit, then replace, then erase. But they underestimated one thing: my memory, my meticulousness, my refusal to go quietly. I began collecting everything into a new directory. I titled it Project Silencer. If they wanted to shut me down, they'd have to deal with the noise first. I wrote annotations under every file, every screenshot, every trace. Lucas's payments, Rachel's connections, Ethan's approvals, Connor's espionage. I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious and focused. There's a kind of clarity that comes with betrayal. It strips away the illusion of fairness, of loyalty. It shows you what people really are when they think you have no power. But they were wrong. My power wasn't in the title on my badge or the office I left behind. It was in the knowledge I carried, the systems I'd engineered, the footprints I could follow in the dark. They thought I would disappear, but I was still here, watching, documenting, and now I was ready to act. I didn't move for nearly an hour after the last file loaded into the Project Silencer folder. The cursor blinked on the screen, rhythmic and unbothered, while my heart pounded a steady drumbeat behind my ribs. The evidence was airtight now. Lucas, Rachel, Ethan, and Connor were all threads in the same tangle. But evidence on its own wasn't enough. Not if I wanted it to matter. I needed a strategy. A way to make the right people take notice without tipping off the wrong ones. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is reactive. It's about emotion. I wanted something cleaner, something that would make them sweat, second-guess, unravel under the pressure of their own fear. And I knew just where to start. I composed a short email to Ethan from a new burner account, encrypted, anonymous, routed through a VPN in Eastern Europe. Just a single line. Some systems remember everything. No attachments. No threats. No signature. Just enough to crack the facade. Enough to let him know someone was watching and that someone knew what he'd done. I hit send. Then I waited. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. I never planned to. But I did let it go to voicemail. Marissa, this is Tracy Bell from HR. I just want to remind you that any further unauthorized access to company systems after termination violates your severance agreement and may result in legal consequences. If you have questions, please contact our office directly. No mention of the email. No direct accusation. But the tremble in her voice said everything. Ethan had received my message and panicked. He must have run straight to Tracy. He was trying to send a message through her, intimidation in HR's clothes. They were scared. Good. But I knew better than to push too hard, too fast. I wasn't looking for legal warfare. I wanted resolution. Change. And I knew someone who might help me get it. Harold Keene. He was no longer a formal board member, but he still held honorary status after stepping down last year. We'd crossed paths during a cyber incident back in 2018 when a breach in a partner firm had threatened our entire vendor system. While others panicked, I'd quietly isolated the entry point and rerouted the data flow, saving the company from $1 million loss. Harold had seen it firsthand. He respected my work, not because I talked loud, but because I delivered. I found his private contact in an old folder I'd saved from the incident. I didn't call or email. That could be traced. Instead, I handwrote a letter, something no algorithm could index. Just a few sentences explaining that I had uncovered critical integrity breaches involving multiple executives and that I needed 15 minutes of his time. I didn't elaborate. I just signed it with my full name, sealed it, and mailed it to his personal residence with tracking. 2 days later, I received a reply. Typed. Precise. Tuesday, 11 a.m. My office. Come alone. The morning of the meeting, I dressed simply, black slacks, gray blazer, hair pinned back. Professional, calm. I wasn't here to rant or beg. I was here to inform. I brought a single manila folder with printed documents, carefully selected screenshots, timeline summaries, and an index of metadata trails. Just enough to paint the picture without overwhelming him. I left the digital evidence at home. Harold's office was a modest space in a historic building downtown. No receptionist, no pretense. He opened the door himself. "Marissa," he said, his eyes sharp behind thin glasses. "Come in." I stepped inside and sat across from him, watching as he leafed through the folder I handed him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask clarifying questions. He just read. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. When he finished, he placed the folder on the desk and folded his hands. "I knew something wasn't right," he said quietly. "Ethan's been pushing too hard to fast-track certain financial reviews. Lucas, too." I raised a red flag at the last board check-in and was politely ignored. I nodded. "They think they buried it with my termination. But you were smarter than they gave you credit for." "I always was," I said, not out of pride, but out of truth. Harold leaned back in his chair. "What do you want, Marissa? Justice? A payout?" I shook my head. "I want accountability. I want the board to see what's happening before more money disappears. Before the company collapses under the weight of its own negligence." He studied me for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "The quarterly board review is in 4 days. I want you to prepare a digital dossier. Clean. Verifiable. Send it to me the night before. I'll get it in front of the people who matter." I rose to my feet. "Thank you, Harold." As I stepped outside into the late morning light, I exhaled slowly. The trap had been sprung. Not for vengeance, but for truth. They fired the wrong woman. Now it was time to show them just how dangerous I could be when no one was watching. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different, less like an echo chamber and more like a war room. Every flat surface in my office was covered with notes, files, hard drives, and diagrams. The past 17 years of my life had become an investigation. Every late-night maintenance log I'd once filed, every system audit I'd run, every offhand email I'd archived out of habit, they all mattered now. Every breadcrumb I'd found was being assembled into something formidable. The dossier had to be airtight. Not just persuasive, but irrefutable. I wasn't simply exposing fraud, I was revealing a coordinated internal conspiracy that threatened the structural integrity of an entire company. If I got this wrong or left a single thread dangling, they'd find a way to dismiss it. They'd spin it as bitterness from a disgruntled former employee. They'd point to my termination and try to frame it as motive. But if I got it right, the truth would speak louder than any defense they could muster. I organized the data into 4 sections: shell vendors, internal complicity, access logs, and financial impact. Each entry was time-stamped, linked to corresponding approvals, and documented with metadata. I included redacted versions of personal email communications to avoid legal gray zones, but noted full access was available upon request. I added diagrams showing the flow of funds between Sovereign Logic accounts and the external entities, NextCore Dynamics, and Everglade Consulting, tracing each payment to its final destination. And finally, I included the internal emails, the thread between Lucas and Ethan, the time-stamped logs of Connor Rives accessing my files. Each one layered like sediment, building the story from suspicion to certainty. I added a brief summary on the first page, clinical and devoid of emotion. The attached report outlines coordinated financial misconduct involving Sovereign Logic CFO Lucas Ellis, his wife Rachel Ellis, and Chief Executive Ethan Rowe, aided by external consultant Connor Rives. Evidence includes falsified vendor identities, unauthorized financial transfers, and documented efforts to suppress internal scrutiny. All data presented was sourced from company systems and backed up in accordance with prior IT redundancy protocols. It was not a plea. It was a professional declaration. I encrypted the full digital dossier and created 2 secure copies, one on a fresh flash drive for Harold, and one on an offline backup drive in my home safe. Then I packaged a summary file, just the high-level overview and the most damning attachments, and uploaded it to a secure email scheduler. The message was set to send to the full board distribution list at precisely 8 a.m. on the day of the quarterly review. Harold would have time to speak to them first. But if he was silenced, delayed, or ignored, the board would still see the truth. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept running through every scenario in my mind. Would they dismiss it? Would they try to spin it? Would someone delete the evidence before it could be reviewed? And yet, underneath all the nerves, I felt something else too. Power. For the first time since they fired me, I wasn't playing defense. I was in control. The next morning, I met Harold again, this time in a cafe downtown. He looked tired but resolute. I passed him the flash drive across the table in a small envelope. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. His trust was clear. "It's scheduled," I said. 8 a.m. sharp. All board members. No traceable metadata back to me, and they can't block it unless they shut down the company's entire mail server. Harold smirked faintly. They won't risk that. Not on review day. We didn't linger. I didn't need to hear his assurances. I already knew I'd done everything I could. That night, I allowed myself a quiet moment on the back porch, watching the stars blink above the roofline. Diana stepped out, wrapped in a sweater, and handed me a glass of wine without saying a word. She'd been patient through all of this, even when I barely spoke, barely ate. She knew this mattered, not just the truth, but reclaiming something they tried to steal from me, my dignity. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself feel that. Not just the anger or the focus or the endless vigilance, but the pride. The satisfaction of knowing that no matter what happened next, I hadn't let them erase me. They'd tried to end my story. Instead, I'd written a new chapter. And by morning, the whole company would read it. I was already awake when the clock turned to 8 a.m. The sky outside was still draped in that pre-dawn haze, the kind that softens everything before the day sharpens its edges. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the laptop screen as though I could somehow see the email being delivered, opened, read. The scheduled message had been locked and encrypted, routed through layers that would take a seasoned IT forensics team days to untangle, if they even knew where to start. It was set to reach every board member's inbox just minutes before the quarterly review. That was no accident. It was a precision strike, designed to detonate in a room full of people who couldn't dismiss it or push it aside. It would demand acknowledgement. At 8:01, my phone buzzed. A notification from one of my monitoring scripts, triggered not by the email itself, but by activity on the internal servers. Multiple logins from executive terminals. VPN access spikes. Internal audit files being opened in rapid succession. Then came the surge in outbound calls. The board had received it, and they were reacting. By 8:15, internal emails from executive assistants began bouncing around, rescheduling meetings, canceling routine calls. At 8:23, I saw the first keyword flag from Sovereign's internal mailing system, urgent review, followed by fraud concern. By 8:30, Harold had logged in remotely from the boardroom node. He was presenting it. I allowed myself a breath. One single breath. Then I set up a silent alert on one of the external media wire services. It wasn't that I planned to leak the story, but I wasn't the only one with eyes on the company now. And if even one board member had a conscience, or a grudge against Lucas or Ethan, it was only a matter of time. Sure enough, at 9:07 a.m., a local tech industry blog published a vague article citing unconfirmed allegations of financial mismanagement at Sovereign Logic, citing an anonymous internal source. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. Someone had talked. By 10 a.m., more outlets had picked it up. Inside Sovereign Logic, things moved faster. I couldn't access the systems directly anymore, but I had lingering log beacons, harmless scripts designed to alert me when system-wide permissions were changed. And suddenly, they were changing everything. Lucas's account was suspended. Connor's credentials were revoked. Ethan's calendar had been wiped entirely. At 10:43 a.m., I received an encrypted message from Harold. "They're in closed-door sessions. You've made your point." They're not just listening, they're stunned. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not out of glee, but relief. For so long, I had been the ghost in the system, the forgotten backbone. But now my voice had become unavoidable. Around noon, I received a call, not from HR, not from Ethan or Lucas, but from Jillian. She was still there, working the floor like I once did. I hadn't reached out to her during all of this. I hadn't wanted to drag her into it. "Marissa," she said, her voice cautious but trembling with energy. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," I replied simply. "They're all scrambling. No one knows what's happening, but the executives are getting pulled into meetings one by one. And people are talking. They know you had something to do with it." "I didn't do it for attention." "I know," she said. "But people are grateful. You were right all along." That caught me off guard. For 17 years, I was invisible, someone who kept things running while everyone else took the credit. I didn't need applause. But hearing that someone noticed, hearing it from Jillian, meant more than I expected. "I'm glad you're still there," I told her. "Watch your back. And keep doing the work with integrity." She paused. "You too, Marissa. And thank you." By late afternoon, the headlines had shifted from vague whispers to pointed speculation. "Sovereign logic rocked by internal investigation," one read. "Sources suggest millions in fraudulent payments," another. No one had named names yet, but it was only a matter of time. I didn't need to push it further. I'd already lit the match. The company would never be the same. And neither would I. I wasn't just the silent architect anymore. I was the catalyst. And for once, they couldn't look away. It was just past dawn when Harold called. Not texted, not emailed, called. The ring cut through the morning stillness like a bell. I answered immediately, bracing for fallout, expecting the worst. Maybe they'd found a way to bury it. Maybe they'd turned on him too. But his voice was calm, measured. There was something underneath it though, something clipped and careful, like he was holding back too much information for a phone call. "Marissa," he said, "they want to meet." I blinked. "Who?" "The board. A few of the independent members. Not all of them, but enough. This afternoon. They're extending the invitation informally for now." I didn't say anything for a beat. My mind was already racing. To what end? To discuss what happens next. I sat down slowly, heart pounding. Are they offering a settlement? A gag order? Harold let out a breath. They're not offering silence. They're offering a position. That caught me completely off guard. "Excuse me?" "They were stunned by the scope of what you exposed," he said. "They've already confirmed internal losses tied to the fake vendors. The auditing firm has been called in. Lucas's resignation is imminent. Ethan's on administrative leave, though he's denying involvement. Connor Rives? Fled the country. The damage is real, but you prevented it from being fatal." I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the soft gray clouds rolling in. "So they want to thank me with a title?" "They want to bring you back in," Harold said. "Not as a consultant. Not as an analyst. They're offering you the role of Chief Risk Integrity Officer. It's new. A position with teeth." I scoffed lightly, not out of amusement, but disbelief. After firing me without warning, they suddenly want to create a seat at the table? "They realized they were dining on a floor you built," he replied. "And it's about more than optics. The shareholders are watching. The press is circling. They need someone who not only knows the system, but who can protect it from the inside." It was tempting, I won't lie. The thought of walking back into sovereign logic not as a ghost, but as someone with authority. Someone untouchable. But I wasn't naive. They would still be executives. They would still try to contain, to sideline, to neuter the threat I represented. "I'll meet with them," I said, "but on my terms." I spent the rest of the morning drafting a document I called Conditions for Return. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. Full audit authority, not just over finances, but over vendor vetting, IT access, and executive actions tied to risk exposure. Direct reporting only to the board, not to the CEO, not to any interim figure they tried to slide into place. Veto power over major system changes and third-party vendor contracts. Autonomy. Independence, and public transparency of the new role scope. No compromise. When I walked into the conference room that afternoon, the air was thick with a kind of nervous respect. 3 board members sat at the far end, none of them familiar faces from my time there. Fresh eyes, I hoped. Harold stood near the side wall, arms folded, watching carefully. "Miss Clark," one of them said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming." I didn't sit. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared and slid it across the table. "If you're serious about bringing me back, you'll agree to every term in this document," I said. "No edits. No conditions. These aren't requests. They're requirements." They exchanged glances. One of them flipped open the folder and began reading. I waited. After a long pause, the woman at the center nodded slowly. "This is aggressive." "It's necessary," I said. "What happened under your noses was the result of unchecked power and poor oversight. If you want me to fix that, I need the authority to do it without politics getting in the way." Silence stretched. Then Harold cleared his throat. "She's right. These aren't demands, they're safeguards." The man to the left leaned forward. "And if we agree? Then I'll rebuild your risk architecture from the ground up," I said. "And I'll make damn sure this never happens again." The woman nodded once more. "We'll review this with legal. But you have our support in principle." I turned and walked out without another word. Outside, the sunlight was just breaking through the clouds. They thought they could erase me, but I'd returned on my own terms. And this time, they were the ones following my lead. The board ratified my return by the end of the week. The vote wasn't unanimous, 2 members abstained, but it passed. The moment it did, a flurry of internal announcements followed. A formal investigation had been launched, organizational restructuring was underway, and a new executive role, Chief Risk Integrity Officer, had been created. That last part earned some raised eyebrows among the staff, especially when my name appeared under the heading, Marissa Clark. Returning not in shame, but in authority, I stepped through the front doors of Sovereign Logic just 8 days after I'd been walked out. This time, there was no box in my hands, no escort. Just the firm tap of my shoes echoing through the corridor as curious faces peeked out from cubicles and glass-walled offices. I didn't make eye contact, didn't stop. I went straight to the conference room where the internal task force had been assembled. 10 people sat around the table: legal counsel, HR, IT security, finance. Jillian was there too, seated nervously at the far end. She gave me a small nod. I returned it with a brief, subtle one of my own. "No time for reunions." "Not yet." I opened the file folder I'd brought and placed a printed chart in the center of the table. "This is a breakdown of the $5.2 million embezzled over the last 9 months, I said. "We've already frozen 2 external accounts, one tied to Next Core Dynamics, the other to Everglade Consulting. The routing numbers connect them to Lucas Ellis and Rachel Ellis, respectively." Someone on the legal team exhaled audibly. "And Lucas?" "Already confessed," I said. He cracked when faced with the evidence we compiled. Documents. Transfers. Access logs. We let him think he had an out if he cooperated, and he took it. His resignation is effective immediately. "What about Ethan?" HR asked. I clicked a remote and brought up the email thread I'd originally uncovered. "He claims ignorance. Says he was rubber stamping based on Lucas's assurances. But he was copied on too many key threads, approved too many off-cycle payments. He's either incompetent or complicit." "Or both," Jillian muttered. I gave her a look, one of warning, but also of appreciation. "We've suspended him pending further review," the legal lead added. "It's likely we'll terminate for cause once the audit concludes." And then there was Connor Rives. "He fled the country," I said. "Took an overnight flight to Belize 2 days after the email went out to the board. But I have logs of everything he accessed, everything he deleted. The system backups I maintained, quietly, I might add, preserved nearly all of it." IT security shifted in their seat. "We always thought those were redundant. Unnecessary. Until they saved your jobs," I replied coolly. No one argued. With the rot exposed, my next job was to reinforce the walls. We launched a full audit of every vendor, every contract, every legacy system. I personally overhauled the approval workflows to require multi-step verification, not just from executives, but from cross-department liaisons. I reinstated anomaly tracking systems that had been quietly retired, programs I had once built, then watched become neglected as trends shifted toward flashier, newer platforms. I had them running again in 48 hours. In a week, We traced nearly $4.6 million of the missing funds and recovered or froze most of it. The remaining portion was still being investigated, but we'd clawed back enough to prove the effort wasn't just performative. More than that, though, we restored integrity. For the first time in years, staff weren't whispering behind closed doors or avoiding tough conversations. People came to me with questions, concerns, observations they'd once buried for fear of retaliation. I wasn't just a watchdog. I was a signal flare in a company that had forgotten how to see in the dark. And then came the emails. From employees I hadn't worked with directly. From old colleagues who'd left years ago. From new hires who'd heard the story and wanted to thank me for not backing down. They didn't know all the details. Most never would. But they knew that something had shifted. That someone had stood up when it counted. On my third Friday back, Jillian brought me a report I hadn't requested. Vendor transparency log, she said, a little sheepishly. Thought we should start automating weekly reviews. You always said systems should speak for themselves. I took the folder from her, smiling. Smart thinking. She hesitated. It's different with you here. How so? People feel seen, she said. Like we're not just cogs anymore. I nodded once. Good. Keep it that way. That night I sat alone in the office, lights dimmed, the quiet hum of the building around me. My screen glowed with the final reconciliation report from the audit team. The damage had been real. Deep. But reparable. Thanks to the systems I'd once built in silence, and the voice I'd finally chosen to raise. Sovereign logic hadn't just survived. It had begun to evolve. And so had I. 6 months had passed, and the halls of sovereign logic felt different, cleaner, brighter. Not because they'd replaced the flickering lights or upgraded the tired carpet tiles, but because the air had changed. The tension that once lingered like an invisible fog had lifted. What remained was purpose. Not fear, not competition. Purpose. I walked those halls now with the authority they once tried to deny me. Not just the title, Chief Risk Integrity Officer, but the respect that came with it. And not the performative, grudging nods handed out like participation trophies. Real respect. Earned, grounded, and rooted in the fact that I had stood when others ducked. That I had seen what they didn't, or refused to, and had done something about it. Jillian now ran day-to-day IT operations. She had grown into the role quickly, with a quiet strength that reminded me of myself in those early years. She didn't try to command attention, but she commanded results. And that mattered more. Every time I passed her team's row, I caught snippets of collaboration, voices asking questions, not barking orders. No more silos. No more fear. In my own office, one with windows this time, and a door that stayed open more often than not, I reviewed the final security audit results from the third-party firm. The report was conclusive. Sovereign Logic had implemented best-in-class risk oversight practices. Our new framework was already being adopted by 2 of our sister companies. They called it the Clark Protocol, which made me chuckle. I hadn't named it. Harold had. The irony of it never left me. That the same systems once ignored, once mocked, had now become the very foundation of our survival. There were days, of course, when the weight still crept in. Days when I remembered sitting in my car with a box of memories, heart pounding, afraid that everything I had built would be lost, erased not by failure, but by people who feared competence. But that feeling no longer haunted me. It reminded me of who I was, of what I'd endured, of why I fought. That afternoon, I met Diana for lunch. We had a tradition now, Fridays at the bistro 2 blocks from the office. She was already waiting at our table by the window, her tablet tucked away, a faint smile on her face. As I slid into the booth, she reached for my hand across the table. "You look lighter," she said, studying me. "Because I'm not bracing for the next fight," I replied. "Not anymore." She smiled wider. "You've changed." "I've returned," I said. To myself. We lingered longer than usual, talking about her new gallery installation and our tentative vacation plans, something we hadn't done in years. The kind of thing that used to feel like a luxury when survival was the only priority. Now it felt deserved. Back at the office, a surprise waited on my desk, a small white box wrapped in cobalt blue ribbon. No note. I opened it to find a crystal figurine of a fortress, tiny, elegant, solid. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its cool weight. It wasn't flashy. It didn't glitter. But it stood, immovable. And I knew exactly what it meant. Some systems fail quietly. Others evolve into fortresses. And this time, the walls were built not just of code and compliance, but of clarity, of courage, of every quiet moment I refused to back down. I placed it beside my monitor and looked out across the office floor. Jillian was reviewing a dashboard with her team. Across the hallway, Harold stood talking to a pair of junior analysts, animated and smiling. In the far corner, HR held a team lunch celebrating a new ethics initiative. No whispers, no shadows. Just movement. Progress. For 17 years, I had been the invisible architect, the quiet builder of foundations no one celebrated until they cracked. But now I was both the builder and the shield. Not just back, but standing taller than ever before. I shut down my computer, grabbed my bag, and walked out into the early evening sun where Diana waited at the curb, waving. They thought I was done. They were wrong. I was just getting started.